Hello and welcome to this COP27 special here on Eye on Africa. Coming up on tonight's show, we go to Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt as the summit kicks off, where for the first time food takes center stage. As changes to the climate gather pace, we ask what future lies in store for the African continent if the goals of today are not met or changed. Thanks again for joining us. Well, the COP27 UN Climate Summit began on Monday in the Red Sea town of Sharm el Sheikh with hopes to avert the worst impacts of climate change. World leaders, policymakers and delegates from nearly 200 countries arrived to discuss the future of the planet, where the African continent is said to be a key point of consternation. Let's cross to our regional correspondent now, Edward Cousin, who is currently stationed in Egypt. Edward, it's been a day full of speeches. Firstly, just opening speeches from world leaders. What could you take from it? What interested you, piqued your interest? And where did Africa fit into those speeches?
Well, to start with the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he was very clear that this COP is about climate solidarity pact. And then he means solidarity between wealthier nations, Western nations, and low-income nations, as nations in Africa. And what he means with the Climate Solidarity Pact is that what will be on the agenda this COP is reparation for loss and damages that have already occurred because of climate change from wealthier nations to low-income nations. So that's a hot topic for countries in Africa as well.
And the fact that it's in Africa, we are seeing it in Egypt, coming at such a particularly delicate time in the world, does that have any significance that now we are discussing climate, which is affecting one of the most under pressure continents?
No, yeah, what people say indeed, like on the continent of Africa, there are a lot of consequences of climate change already being felt, and they already suffer from the consequences of climate change. But at the same time, they contribute very little to carbon emissions. So is that fair? That's then the big question, and that's something that is going to be discussed this COP. So in the Egypt also as host likes to portray itself or positions itself as a leader of Africa, or at least part of Africa in these negotiations with wealthier countries about possible loss and damage compensation.
Thanks very much. That's Edward Cousin. He is in Egypt right now for the COP27 summit. Now he is talking about the contributions to climate change. Africa contributes just 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and some of the most adversely affected regions in the world by climate change happen to be in the continent. We've seen recent floods in Nigeria, Chad and Senegal, droughts in Kenya, famine in Sudan and Somalia, and melting glaciers even in Tanzania. They're just some of the notable ways in which the continent is suffering at an accelerated pace. As the talks proceed, though, Caroline Lambolet takes a closer look at what's at stake for Africa.
Distinguished
actions, not words. That seems to be the watchword for African countries as COP27 kicks off in Egypt.
That will be the cherry on top of the cake. If we get that adaptation finance decision, which is to say, no, don't give us more finance. Please don't pledge more finance. The finance you already pledged, just tell us how you're going to do it. Let's meet twice a year. Let's have consultation. Let's see how this is going to happen. Let's be transparent, accountable, and let's see how we can country drive this and have more ownership about this. That will be a very good start.
Senegalese President Macky Sall issued a similar plea on Sunday as he addressed the assembly and urged those in attendance to make history.
Make history by honouring our commitments, all our commitments, including the one for $100 billion per year to support adaptation efforts for developing countries, which has yet to be fully implemented.
On Sunday, UN climate negotiators offered a sliver of hope for developing countries. They agreed to discuss the thorny issue of a loss and damage fund. African countries are responsible for less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. but they are disproportionately vulnerable to the devastating effects of global warming.
People are suffering, disasters are happening, the floods in Nigeria. We need to give all these examples because the people from most affected communities tell the stories better. So this is why I am at the COP, to raise the demands, to speak up for the people who are not able to be here.
During last year's COP summit in Glasgow, the EU and the US rejected calls for a separate financial mechanism, and negotiators instead agreed to start a dialogue on financial compensation.
Well, we've seen there that financing is one of the key issues being discussed at the talks. Joining me now to unpack the importance of what extra resources could mean to Africa is the head of the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development, Alvaro Lario. Alvaro, we've seen basically that there was a lot of funds which were promised to Africa and developing nations in COPs gone by, but you yourself in some research recently have revealed that we are nowhere near to achieving those goals. What needs to be done?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Indeed, I think you summarized it very well before. It's about action and finance, 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 finance. In our case, we have been a leader in channeling funding to rural and to small-scale farmers. We do so in almost 100 countries, but very especially, most of our climate financing is on adaptation. We work on food security, and very clearly, food security is also about climate adaptation and how making sure that the adaptation techniques works and makes a real difference for the lives of rural communities. Let me put you some examples of what we do. So we help small-scale farmers switch to drought-tolerant crops, set up small-scale irrigation systems, diversify their production, plant local crops that are better adapted to climate change. These are the projects we're currently working on.
What kind of success stories can you point to? I think you've got a talk on Saturday about in desert areas basically being able to grow forestry or agricultural products. Can you point to anything in particular?
Well, I mean, it's always very difficult when we talk about building resilience. That means not going from crisis to crisis through humanitarian assistance. What does resilience mean? So I will be very specific. What does resilience or climate adaptation mean for small-scale farmers? So this could be early warning systems, restoration of wastelands, as you have mentioned, replanting of forests, small-scale irrigation or precision irrigation systems, large-scale restoration of the landscape, access to green loans in order for many. This is a very successful program we have right now in the Sahel, which provides opportunities for many of the migrant populations to adapt to climate change by making it easier to access to certain green loans at very low rates. So all of these type of projects, and especially as you have mentioned, for example, in the Great Green Wall, Sahel, which is a very challenging Horn of Africa, I think these are the countries that really need our funding, and we should make a big effort to provide them with the funding.
And how do you reach out to those wealthier nations and say to them, listen, we really need your help here? What can you do to convince them to come to the party?
So in many cases, this is to a certain extent happening through some of the multilateral development banks, public development banks, but it's not enough. I mean, we need also the local governments, we need the private sector. So to me, COP27 must really be about action, credibility, and justice. As you have said, leaders must fulfill their commitments, deliver on these urgent investments. I'm really looking to a COP27 focused on action, concrete programs on the ground, because we all know that doing nothing will really cost more in the future than if we act now. So today, we also know that the trend is not good. 2023 is going to look much worse because of the current fertilizer crisis. We are on a dangerous path. And I have really seen the change happen, and really the power of the investments. In our case, we have built in the last 3 years, we have built the resilience of almost 38 million people. We have enabled 77 million people to increase their income, 62 million to increase their production. So the difference can happen. We just need more financing, more people on the ground.
So if you could, I'll put you on the spot a little bit here, but if you could take one thing from COP27, wave a magic wand and say, this is the solution, what would you wish this summit to produce?
So I would say concrete commitments from the donor countries in the case of loss and damages, as well as really making visible how are they going to make happen this 100 billion commitment. whether it's through their own governments, whether it's through loans, whether it's through multilateral development banks, but we need something to really report and be able to show that actually change is happening on the ground.
Thanks very much. That's Mr. Alvaro Lario, the president of the International Fund for Development of Agricultural Industry. Thanks very much. And that's the UN. Well, they believe that Saint Louis in northern Senegal is one of the most threatened cities in the world when it comes to rising sea levels. In 2018, the government launched a €95 million project to relocate people from at-risk neighborhoods 11 kilometers inland. The move was hailed internationally as a model for adapting to climate change, but more than 4 years on, not everything has gone to plan. Sam Bradpiece and Eliman Ndao have more.
Saint Louis, one of Senegal's largest cities, is at risk of disappearing. Over the course of a decade, close to 1 kilometre of its coastline has been lost to rising sea levels. Despite the risk of flooding, many residents of the Langue de Barbarie, one of the most flood-prone areas, are determined to stay.
We're forever tied to the sea. This is the land of our ancestors. Fishing is all we know. We can't live anywhere else. We'll never leave here.
Others have accepted their fate. Ndeye Anta lost her family home to flooding 4 years ago. Today she lives in a camp with other climate refugees.
Come and see where I live.
Some 1,500 people currently stay in these sweltering shelters.
We are cut off from the world here. We need to travel for kilometers to get to the nearest shop. We don't have water or electricity, and it is very hot inside.
A more permanent settlement is being built to accommodate Ndeye Anta and others like her. The project is funded by the Senegalese government and the World Bank and aims to house 15,000 climate refugees in total. This new neighbourhood is more than 10 kilometres from the sea.
As far as mobility is concerned, it'll be problematic. But when it comes to improving living standards, we'll succeed. We've prepared a clean site with all the essential features: a primary school, a middle school, a health centre and a market.
Officials hope that the first permanent housing will be finished within 8 months.
That's all that we have for Eye on Africa this evening. Of course, we will be bringing you plenty from the COP27 summit. But there's more news coming up here on France 24. For me, it's bye for now.